Okay. So today we're lucky to have Dr. Dana Kornberg with us for our second seminar. And it's pretty early for her in the morning, so we're very fortunate she accepted this offer. Today her seminar will focus on urban waste, which is a very hot topic for us as well, where we are increasingly talking about zero waste and trying to find ways to achieve this goal. And she will give us her perspective on this issue of urban waste from India and from a lens of a sociologist. So I know we're a team of an interdisciplinary group. We are an interdisciplinary group, but it will be interesting to have a sociologist's perspective as well. So Dana Kornberg is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Michigan, Santa Barbara. She's studying racialized and casted urban environmental institutions in India and the United States. Her valuable research has been published in venues such as Social Forces, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Local Environment, and the Economic and Political Weekly. She's currently working on a book which is titled as The Garbage Economy, Pursuing Money and Scrap in Urban India's Casted Institutions. And in this book, she's examining how relations based on caste and community have upheld Delhi's informal door-to-door garbage collection and recycling system in the face of former collection trucks and incinerators. So I have a feeling that we will see some commonalities in our system. So let's see what India has and what Dana is going to present to us. The floor is yours, Dana.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and yeah, thanks to all of you for being here at the end of your day. So yeah, I'm excited to speak with you and definitely to see what kind of comparative forms of conversation may come out of this. So yeah, as Idam said, I'm an environmental sociologist, and I'm interested in the cultural politics of infrastructure. So I work in both India and the United States. So I do take a comparative perspective on my work. And this is part of what I'm going to be presenting to you today is a chapter from my book project, which is currently under contract with Oxford University Press. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. So I just want to start off, the paper which talks about alchemization is concerned with fire. And of course, this past month, Delhi was in the news for fire when one of its largest dump sites in North Delhi at Balaswa burned for more than 2 days in record-breaking heats. Right, so the rotting food waste that comprises these landfills transformed into flammable methane, and that then combusted. So I'm going to be talking about the particular items that are in different things just to sort of signal that. And this added to the toxic smoke that already chokes the city on any given normal day. When I did my fieldwork, I was looking at the power of waste to be transformed into something new, but through more intentional means. On the one hand, there were the fires that burned plastics off of metal wires, such as the one pictured here. And I would see these regularly as I walked into the kabadi bastis, or the places where Delhi's waste workers live, informal waste workers and recyclers live with their families. A fire like this one, I would see often in the winter, as the collected badminton rackets, screwdrivers, hammers, umbrellas, hanging wire baskets, etc., would be packed onto a pile and burned. And then the next day I would see the rectangular bundles that would be packed of all of these metals being wrapped up with white plastic strips ready for sale into recycling markets. On the other hand, there were other types of fires that were being stoked in Delhi when it came to the process of recovering garbage. Pictured here, of course, is an incinerator or waste to energy plant that solid waste professionals were promoting the construction of. During my period of fieldwork between 2013 and 15, and I've done follow-up visits since then, 3 newly constructed incinerators were being built. and 48 more were being sanctioned across 12 Indian states. And then 100 more were being planned in the works. So there are a lot of plans for incinerators being built across the country. And the contrast between these two systems is what I want to talk about today, and really centering these processes, centering this process of burning leads us to think about what types of systems each of these institutions, on the one hand, this formal system that's promoting incineration, and on the other hand, the informal system that's promoting recycling, are engaged in. So the question that I ask in this talk and in this paper is, what are the social and material processes through which garbage becomes fuel on the one hand in incineration or waste to energy, and on the other hand becomes what are called items for recycling on the other? And this leads us to think about these two different systems and what kind of social institutions are configuring them. So just to preface my argument, or to let you know what I'm going to be talking about in more detail, I say garbage becomes items for recycling at the hands of low caste and Muslim informal workers, and fuel for incineration is overseen by formal upper caste managers and bureaucrats. And so what this leads us into talking about are the types of technologies and processes that are available not only to the government versus the informal, but to different social actors or social groups within society, and also leads us to confront some of those very durable social divides that I argue would need to be addressed in order to truly build a more socially and environmentally just system. In terms of the fieldwork I did, I just like to give a summary of the data for the bulk of my fieldwork from 2013 to 2015. I've also done follow-up visits to Delhi over the years, most recently in March 2020. But I did 97 total interviews, spoke with informal recyclers, or the people that collect garbage specifically door to door in Delhi and take out recycling from that, providing the primary door to door service in the city. I worked alongside those collectors. I went to their villages on a couple of visits. And then I also interviewed people that buy the recycling up the chain, and policymakers. I spoke with policymakers as well to try to contextualize the changing system that was underway with the introduction of more formalized truck collection and larger capital projects such as these waste to energy plants. At the time when I was doing fieldwork, garbage was a problem that had multiple types of instantiations. On the one hand, it was litter on the street, or smells alongside the road, or of overflowing dump sites that policymakers and residents were concerned about. But writ large, garbage was depicted as a giant mass threatening to bury the entire city. It was depicted as both a mountain and a tsunami on the move, which I argue epitomizes material and symbolic threats, not only to Delhi, but also to the nation as a whole. So it's important to think about how, on the one hand, garbage is a very real physical public health problem, but it also is, of course, a highly symbolic material that evokes ideas of purity and pollution and stigma. And these are some of the cultural considerations that I'm concerned with. After 2 informal workers died who were working on the garbage dump in Ghaziapur in 2017, India's Supreme Court famously compared its height to Delhi's iconic 12th century Qutb Minar, proclaiming that India will go down under garbage one day. So it's into this much larger context that the city of Delhi shifted the way that it was approaching garbage. So moving from just very simply the city government that was responsible for all of the waste management, officially responsible for all the waste management in the city, created this public-private partnership in around 2009. And with the construction of this new formal public-private partnership system, this was what was behind the building of these waste to energy plants and also sanitary landfills and some larger composting efforts. But the effort really going primarily towards door-to-door collection and waste to energy or incineration. But of course, when these programs were introduced in an attempt to clean up the city and to address this garbage problem, there was this very large existing informal recycling system that included the door-to-door workers who I was working alongside across Delhi, estimated to be at least 200,000 strong, although numbers are of course difficult to capture. So what I'm interested in this chapter of this larger work is thinking about the cultural politics of these materials and what it means for garbage to become, on the one hand, recyclables at the hands of informal workers, and on the other hand, fuel when it's something that is becoming fuel for electricity in waste to energy plants. Others have written about these conflicts as political economy and the ways that waste to energy plants rely on the same materials that recyclers do, namely plastics and papers in particular that are highly combustible. But I like to think about some of the cultural politics that underlie these, because I think some of that depth helps us to understand how difficult it would be to actually address and potentially change this system. So I draw on a few different perspectives. So one is critical materiality studies and understanding similar materials, in this case garbage, can be interpreted, used, and valued differently by different groups or actors. From discard studies, I take up the lesson that what is considered waste varies by context, of course, and that affects how it's treated and also what is produced in the first place, right? So of course, places like India, but most places around the world, we have so much growing consumption of plastics and disposable items. And so this is tremendously changing that context. And this is leading to these new technologies, on the one hand, creating more recycling markets for the plastics that are being produced, but on the other hand, also creating the possibility for waste to energy plants to be able to run if they do get a hold of those plastics. And to be able to understand how these things change and are valued differently by different actors, and how what is considered waste can shift even across a given particular context, I use a lens that's called the biography of things, which some of you may well be familiar with from the social sciences, drawing. So the idea that materials can gain and lose value as they circulate across those contexts. So basically what I'm looking at here, what matters from these different ideas, is that I am looking at how garbage is circulating in these two different systems and trying to understand what it is that makes them valuable or lose value. And the idea of alchemization I draw on just as a sort of evocative way of capturing that process, and particularly the sense that as garbage is circulating, or as waste materials are circulating, they are circulating towards increasing social and economic value. And so just as lead was not turned into gold, but just as the idea that lead could be turned into gold, and soil could be turned into salt, mercury could be turned into medicine, I argue there's this idea that garbage can be turned into money in a pretty straightforward way, that belies what is actually required in order for that to happen, in the case of incineration, which relies on a lot of subsidies. And also that this requires a pretty intensive process of destigmatization in a context where working with, and especially alongside garbage, is something that has traditionally or historically imparted a lot of social harm on the communities that have done that work, particularly low caste and Dalit communities. And so in order to realize the benefits of turning garbage into money, groups need to be able to destigmatize it, and then I'll talk about how that is accomplished. So on the one hand, we have recycling, which involves what I call garbage as items. So producing garbage into quote unquote items, or things that can be sold for recycling. That's what the items are. And yeah, and so this is one process through which garbage is alchemized as it transforms from something that is wasted and valueless into a set of recyclables that can be sold for money by the informal economy. So what this looks like is, so this is one of the workers who I worked alongside, and sorry, I'm realizing I don't have my notes on a couple of slides, but that's okay. So yeah, so the workers that I worked alongside, this is Minu pictured here. Someone I worked in one of Delhi's middle class and predominantly upper caste neighborhoods that you can see here. This is in North Delhi. And the process of alchemizing trash into items through the informal economy begins when collectors, of course, get access to that waste. In this case, that takes place door to door. That's the work that I was doing. So someone like Minu would take his cart out every morning, bring it to the household every single day at a particular time. And the initial sort of materials commences when he collects the plastic bags from every individual household, climbing stairs, meeting them at the door, and then opening the bags into the cart, putting any of the recyclables into the back, this sack that you can see hanging out the back here. And then any of the, or sorry, actually that's for the, it's for the recyclables. And then in the front is all of the organic waste or mylar packets and things that can't be recycled. On the front, he has a blue plastic bucket that's hanging. That's for stale bread that gets sold separately to feed cows. And so it's this initial sort in the cart where he needs to be able to work quickly, open the bags with his hands, and sort these materials into their kindred piles in order to commence this process that will continue back at his, back where he is living in Delhi, where things are further segregated into additional piles. So this is a view inside the cart where you can see on the one hand, the materials that are segregated for recycling. So you can see paper, plastic bags, brown paper bags, etc. And then the mylar packets. This was the summertime, you can tell because there are mangoes in the back and hay, and that was probably from a cooler running in the hot Delhi heat. And yeah, and so there's a seasonality as well to this work where not only are the materials that are available varying by season, where you can see the mangoes coming, the cucumbers, the cool winter greens that will come in the summer, but winter also bringing things like liquor bottles and condoms as people are locked up in their homes, not locked up, but finding refuge from what is a pretty hazy and chilly Delhi season. But also the seasonality changes the amount of scrap. So the workers need to be attuned to how much money they're going to earn by season, with the summer months typically bringing more plastic bottles and other types of waste from festivals that can be sold into the recycling markets to earn them more cash. Once that comes back to workers' settlements, it gets sorted into up to 20 different items, as you can see here. So operating kind of like a human conveyor belt in this image, the women are segregating all of those different mixed plastics and papers into their different piles. And what this involves is not only a matter of looking at those materials and quickly pulling them out, but sometimes it's listening for a particular sound that a plastic bag will make, or a plastic film will make. Or it can be using a magnet to figure out which type of metal is being recovered. And so there are different senses that these workers need to engage in order to understand what is being segregated. And this was something that was taught to me when I was there, as one of the women pictured here, who I affectionately referred to as Auntie, would test my knowledge, like what type of plastic is this? Which pile does it go in? And really love to poke fun at me as somebody who's, white and from the West and getting a PhD and not knowing the answer. So once we use our senses and workers use their senses to hear and feel these materials, what's resulted is the production of 12 to 28 different items. These are commodities that would then be sold for cash, ranging from plastic bags to paper, cardboard, and bottles. In addition to sight and sound, there was fires, of course, that burned plastics off of metals, and other types of, they would scrape the paint out of paint cans, right, in order to be able to recycle those. There's a whole set of processing mechanisms that go on that are very bodily, that require a lot of manual labor and a lot of direct engagement with the materials to be able to render them as items that can be recycled. Alchemizing garbage into items for recycling also required knowing and understanding what categories were available to be recycled, i.e. which things go where and which things just couldn't be recycled altogether. And this could vary across the city. So it required that collectors would develop that specific area level knowledge in terms of understanding, in South Delhi, for example, there was a market for styrofoam, but that market did not exist in North Delhi. There just weren't buyers up there. Eventually, all of this stuff goes into often local or regional recycling markets. So this is a plastic bottle factory where plastic bottles are broken down into flakes that you could see in the bags that are lining this warehouse. And also things, of course, like plastic bags. Delhi has a robust plastics industry, so you can actually follow it from the point of recovery all the way through to the processing of new goods. These are plastic bags being made from largely from recycled plastic. So just to summarize, recycling garbage as items involves the manual collection and sorting, which is done by low caste and Muslim informal workers. And this involves using the senses, so touch, sight, sound in particular, to recognize individual materials and understand what can be recycled. It requires that local knowledge. And it involves high levels of stigma, right? So when workers are going through the waste with their hands on the street, this is a moment when they are often, they're likely to either be ignored by local residents who tend to be upper caste in these middle class areas, or they will be told to move their carts because there's a bad smell, things like that are highly stigmatizing and kind of degrading experiences for the people doing this work. There's also potential physical danger that workers need to navigate as they sift through the garbage, and there can be broken glass in there, but also things like I mentioned used condoms, but also diapers and menstrual pads, and things that have and other types of hospital waste. So although this process results in the production of commodities, which are relatively destigmatized, it requires them to engage in a manual labor that is very stigmatizing and at times also dangerous. Garbage as fuel, on the other hand, is something that has been promoted by predominantly upper caste professionals who have leveraged that stigma of garbage and captured it as what they call the new business frontier, right? It's a space that upper caste professionals did not want to engage in because it is such a stigmatizing profession everywhere, but especially in the Indian context where it does have longstanding relationships to caste in terms of who does the dirty work, although the same could be said about the United States and the racial division of labor that we've had historically here. India's new solid waste professionals have attempted to alchemize garbage into this commodity of fuel, and this transforms a highly stigmatizing material into a more benign one, namely fuel that is burned to produce electricity. Their approaches are more centralized, and they rely on processes of quantification. This cultivates distance from the stigma that low caste informal workers have to endure and creates a new professional jurisdiction. Solid waste professionals describe this process very simply as quote unquote monetizing the garbage. Known as waste to energy plants, despite the relatively small amounts of electricity that's produced in the Delhi context, incineration has gained popularity amongst India's major national parties And that's been propelled especially by the National Smart Cities mission and then Prime Minister Modi's Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, or the Clean India campaign, which has brought additional funding and removed a lot of the approval required for environmental clearances in order to get these projects up and running. When garbage is produced into fuel, as they are at these 3 plants across Delhi, it's transformed from this slimy, smelly, overpowering pile of waste into something that's much more benign. And this is something that solid waste professionals can manage indirectly from their comfortable offices. But the appeal of these technologies lies in their promise. The appeal of these technologies lies in their promise to reduce the geographic footprint of garbage disposal from those towering and very dangerous dump sites. But it also benefits politicians, bureaucrats, and business people through things like contracts and kickbacks, and receives support from large institutions like not only the central government, but the Asian Development Bank, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. In addition to these 3 that are pictured here with the triangles, there are 4 more being planned across the city. The first plant that was built in Delhi at Okla, the Jindal project at Okla, that is up and running. It was quickly sued by residents in 2009 for its proximity to their neighborhood and its lack of regulation. But in spite of this, there have been some penalties for these companies, or for this company in particular, through the case that is, I believe, still ongoing. But nevertheless, it's been running, and there has been continued opposition from local communities and environmental activists. What the outside support for waste to energy or incineration projects in India have conveniently ignored, however, is that the technology has been widely deemed inappropriate for Indian garbage. What one engineer that I interviewed referred to as quote unquote Indian garbage, which is primarily organic, especially after it has been stripped by waste pickers. In order for Delhi incinerators to run as they were designed, to alchemize garbage as actual fuel that would fire these plants, they would require paper and plastic waste. But as a range of experts told me, incineration and even the refuse-derived fuel, or RDF technologies that have been adopted for India's relatively wet waste, require a level of petroleum-derived plastics and fibrous papers that Indian waste simply does not have. This makes the question of why professionals have nevertheless favored incineration technologies all the more urgent. So just to put some numbers to that, a sanitation chief in Delhi said for power generation, the fuel should have a minimum calorific value, the measurement of how a material burns, of 2,500 to 3,000 per kilocalorie, but Delhi garbage has a value of 550 to 600. So if these projects are unlikely to succeed on their own terms, it's reasonable to ask why they've had so much appeal. And one of the things that I think is important to recognize is the powerful alchemy that waste to energy incinerators promise. And this has both symbolic and economic significance for the people who are involved in them. They promise the ability to control the waste stream on the one hand, to shift the waste stream from the realm of the low caste informal economy into the domain of a more professionalized, more predominantly upper caste bureaucracy and management team, but also to alchemize garbage into fuel and eventually money that would then bring those material resources into the hands of this new group. The eminence of machines in the professional imagination was something that really solidified for me when I was visiting an office in Delhi one afternoon, leaving a solid waste company office. Having completed an interview, I looked up to see a shrine assembled from images of a light-skinned Jesus and garbage collection trucks on top of this cabinet. And it just made me understand that side by side, these garbage trucks and these machines were taking on a much more venerated status. In addition, mechanization also promised to capture the recyclables themselves that informal workers depend on for a living. In turn, managers that I interviewed tended to characterize informal recyclers as rag pickers, which is the common term used in India, but many would also use casteist and anti-Muslim tropes, referring to them as inferior, smelly, drug addicted, and Bangladeshi. Professionals and bureaucrats also noted workers' tendency to unionize and contest working conditions. Where one mechanized plant had opened, just 40 or 50 workers had been hired, and where 1/4 of Delhi's trash was going to be processed in North Delhi, they were planning to hire just 84 people. I should just say one other thing. So yeah, during a major industry conference, so in addition to some of those political economic concerns about how many workers were being hired and what kind of control companies would be able to exert over workers, those who were promoting waste to energy at a major industry conference described that, one company manager described a 24 megawatt power plant being constructed in North Delhi. And he said, this plant is fully enclosed to ensure that there is no odor or noise elements. If undesired smells were said to be contained, another executive director of another company went even further. He said, today's plant looks better, referring to these waste to energy plants in contrast to the dump site in the background here. On the foreground of this image, we see a pretty small sanitary landfill that's being built alongside it. But describing these waste to energy plants, he said, today's plant looks better. We can even have our lunch there. We have our guest house there. We have a staff quarters. I don't think, but I can, he's like, I don't think I've gone to about 14 or 15 dump sites, but if you go to a dump site, you have to take a head to toe bath. 14 hours later, you'll still be smelling the same dump because it sticks to your nostrils. Once in a while, it reminds you that you have come and gone back. But he says here there's nothing that smells, right? So the idea that creating these large waste to energy plants are also containing these smells and these other stigmatizing qualities of garbage that allow professionals like him to be able to work with it directly. So the objective here, even if not realized in practice, was to discipline laborers into being countable and accountable. As this is a slide from a municipal presentation a few years back. Just picturing what the person who created the presentation for the city government imagined waste workers being, i.e. young children. I worked alongside adults and then being transformed into this person who, I don't know what country's uniform that is. It could be Turkey, but yeah, it looks in a European country. So weighed by the ton and measured by the kilocalorie and megawatt, garbage becomes a commodity that can be monetized into a single number when weights are multiplied by the rate per ton. This is another slide from a government presentation, just basically showing what happens to garbage at the hands of the system when, of course, this is something that many of us may take for granted, but where garbage becomes something that we measure by the metric ton, and that gets converted into power units that are generated over time. And the finances are not accounted for here, but we can imagine that if we multiply the metric ton by the disposal amounts that are being paid and add in the subsidies they're receiving, we would be able to understand, and certainly the companies would have a better handle on what they're making as a result. So when successful, this accomplished distance in the form of these giant waste to energy plants that create a desensitized, desensory type of experience creates a kind of distance from the senses that allows garbage to be revalued and monetized as this distinct commodity in the hands of the system. So just to summarize, incinerating garbage as fuel entails mechanizing the processes of collection and disposal. This is something that's overseen predominantly by upper caste managers, bureaucrats, and engineers. Treats garbage as a singular mass, which can be measured by the ton, kilocalorie, and price. And that, of course, stands in contrast to garbage becoming dozens of different items for recycling. So both become commodities, right? But they're different commodities, one fuel, one set of recyclables. This depends on engineering expertise, large capital or access to large capital, and connections to government and international organizations. And it really has a much better handle on destigmatizing connections to the waste by mechanizing these processes and outsourcing the manual labor to workers who are much fewer in number under the system. The ecological implications, or why this matters, if we're, what brings us together here is a concern for the environment. So alchemizing garbage into recycling, of course, depends on the sensory relationship to waste and creates arguably like a certain type of ethical relationship to materials. But this is, of course, a case of the environmentalism of the poor, what's been called the environmentalism of the poor. By scholars like Martinez Ayer in Barcelona, in Spain. And and so while this is arguably a more ecological or environmental approach, it is something that is born out of necessity as workers are doing the type of work that they are able to do in order to earn a living. Alchemizing garbage into fuel, on the other hand, creates pathways of dependence. Incinerators, of course, create path dependence. They require garbage to run over time. So there's a major concern with the construction of so many of these projects across Delhi and what that will portend for their need to continue running. At the moment when they don't have enough materials to run, they have to rely on diesel fuel in order to produce the electricity that they need to produce. On the other hand, incineration or waste to energy threatens the livelihoods of the low caste and Muslim poor, as it will increasingly, will need to capture those plastics and papers in order to meet their targets. And so what I end with is not a solution, but a question, and I think a more appropriate question that asks us to think about what it would take to challenge this dominant power structure, which benefits from incineration to promote more ecologically and socially just decentralized approaches. This is something that many others have written about, probably many in this room are thinking about, but my argument is to think about how the power structure or the social relationships that are underlying each of these systems are quite sticky and durable and require us to take them up directly. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Wow, thank you, Dana. This was really, in a nutshell, very enlightening about us, at least for me, which I don't know much about India and Delhi in specific. So I think it's a good time to pose your questions. We have like 15 minutes of time as well.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just also invite you, I know it was a lot to pack in and there were a lot of different things going on. So anyone should feel free to also ask clarifying questions. And there are no bad questions.
Thanks. Pranaj, please.
Thank you, Dana, for this very inspiring talk. I hope you can all hear me. I'm outside in a public space. Sorry for that. I was interested, I was curious about the ecological implications of both methods. So do you know any reports about any assessment about the CO2 or net CO2 emissions for both methods? So one is recycling, the other is incineration, and considering that incineration has been supported by the UN and so on, I was interested to know whether, I mean, how do they compare to each other? Is there any data, anything that we could know about this? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's one of those deceptively simple questions that there should be an easy answer to, but anyone else should feel free to chime in, but I don't believe there has been a direct comparison, although, I don't want to speak too soon because I can think of good work that's been done to look at each of the systems and to try to look at the plastics recycling system in Delhi. I think one of the challenges with that is that it's so decentralized and so unregulated in terms of, especially for plastics recycling in the city of Delhi. And there's a lot of different politics going on in terms of attempts to regulate the system. I mean, in general, of course, in general, we say, recycling is better, right, in terms of the pyramid of waste to energy coming below recycling. But in terms of doing a more robust life cycle analysis, I would need to look for that and see if there's a way of coming up with it based on the data that's available.
Okay, any other questions? I have one if nobody has. So I was wondering, so at the beginning you talked about individual garbage collectors who go up door to door and collect the garbage and then categorize in their own units. So how do they divide the territory? Because I assume certain neighborhoods would have higher value garbage. So is there like a hierarchy or unspoken rules among this low caste? Is there another casting amongst them? So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, so actually one of the things that's interesting and that I write about in the book is the division of labor between, so interestingly, one of the things is when we talk about this being the realm of low caste communities, I think often outside of India, and especially here in the US, we tend to think of caste as this sort of, very, historical, unchanging, rigid system, when in fact, of course, just like any social system of social stratification, it changes over time, maybe not in radical ways, but certainly in ways that are notable and change individuals' experiences. So all of that to say, there's a community that had been collecting garbage or responsible for Delhi's garbage and still does the majority of the government work, which is the Valmiki community. And there's a great book about them by Vijay Prasad called Untouchable Freedom. But what's happened in the last couple of decades is the Valmikis who have long had those neighborhood jurisdictions, they've started subcontracting to newer migrants from Eastern India who are predominantly Muslim and coming from West Bengal and previously from Bangladesh as well. There's a whole politics to that. And so, yeah, so you have a division of labor often between who has the rights to the territory. In the area where I lived, that was often somebody from the Valmiki community. And then there was the person that was doing the actual door-to-door collection who tended to be a newer Muslim Bengali migrant. And so there is a division of labor there. And so one of the things I'm interested in, I've written about, is what I call the castification of these Muslim workers who are treated exactly the same as the low caste Dalit workers, even though they're coming from communities that are hundreds of miles away and have not been historically tasked with doing this garbage work in the city. And then there is also a difference between different neighborhoods in the city. And so, some of that, people are relatively limited in their mobility. The way they get into this work is often through who they know, of course. So if somebody's coming from their village in West Bengal, they come to the area where their fellow villagers are already living. So it's not the case that they're looking at the city and trying to figure out where the highest value work is. But that being said, in places where there are higher value garbage and higher income, wealthier communities, I did see a different system where sometimes instead of just having access to that territory, they would actually buy a contract off of somebody who had access to that territory. So it became that also became something that could be bought and sold. Whereas in the rest of the city, those tended to be mutually agreed upon boundaries. So because they tie back predominantly to the Valmiki community, everyone sort of mutually recognizes who has the rights to collect from which area, and they tend to be passed down hereditarily.
Pretty interesting, because like in Turkey, we have pretty good land management or waste management system. So the municipality, at least in Istanbul, collects everyone's garbage and then takes it to the landfill. But we still have mostly immigrants who go through the garbage, not from door to door, but where we put our trash out, go through the garbage and try to monetize it. But I'm not a specialist like you are, but I knew what you were working on, so I was quite interested in when I first moved to Istanbul, and I asked a couple of times, and apparently there is segmentation amongst them as well. Some of them only collect paper, some of them only collect plastic, some of them collect glass, and their territories are pretty clearly defined. They don't pass each other's territory. So it seems like this monetizing garbage is not unique to only India, but there is money into it.
Yeah, certainly not. I mean, of course, even here in the wealthiest nation in the world, where we have, also some of the most intense inequality, we have, people rifling through garbage for cans. Yeah, here in Santa Barbara, where the average home costs $2.1 million, we have so many people who are homeless as a result. So yeah, certainly we even see that here, but I think it's such an interesting case. And when I teach this, I love to point out the contrast between centralization and decentralization, and the ways that the informal decentralization or the de facto decentralization of many of these systems can nevertheless be very effective, and often be more effective because people are plugging in where there's a need, for better or worse, right? I mean, again, these are not jobs that are coveted or desired by nearly anybody, but they do provide a service to the city. So.
It does. Cam?
Thank you, Dana. I want to know a bit about the organization of this low-caste garbage collectors. Are they egalitarian in their organization, or is it very hierarchical, or is it more like a cooperative or more like a mafia type of organization?
Yeah, thank you. So as I was mentioning, this is great to follow up from the last question from Idam, like the idea that so there's, as I mentioned, there's a hierarchy in the sense that the Valmiki community, who has these longstanding hereditary rights to collect from certain parts of the city or from certain neighborhoods or blocks of the city, in recent years, or in the last 20 years or so, as there have been more plastics and things to recover from household garbage, there's been this division of labor at that level, at the neighborhood level, where it's being collected between the person who has the rights to collect and then the person who's doing the manual work. So you can definitely see that the hierarchy there. In terms of within their communities, so the community that I worked in, or the communities that I worked in, were predominantly Muslim Bengali communities. And there, I would say there was a sort of de facto collectivity. These are relatively new migrants, either first or second generation migrants from villages. And, things operate, and, there's a lot of analogy to how things function in the villages. Of course, people are very much on top of one another, living in very crowded and small huts in crowded circumstances. But there is also a hierarchy in terms of, there's a hierarchy in terms of there being a person who acts as the buyer in most communities. And so that person will be sort of the go-to person or intermediary between the informal collectors, who are the ones doing the manual work, and access to the markets outside of the communities. But that person also often serves as an intermediary for things like run-ins with the law in various forms, or getting access to voter ID cards, things like that. So there is a, I'd say, but then in recent years, there's been an attempt of collectors to sort of bypass that person in large part and try to sell on their own directly into markets. So there's a lot of, interesting changes that are happening in this space that I'm interested in. There is some, direct organization in terms of forming cooperatives in some cities. It hasn't been as prominent in Delhi. So a city like Pune or Ahmedabad have seen that type of organization, for example. In Delhi, it has tended to be much more, much more informal. Like there aren't explicit types of organization that are happening, but I was able to see how people are organizing themselves just by being in the communities in a more de facto type of way.
Irma?
First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. Like it actually changed my view in so many different directions. I was like never thinking that incineration might also have some problems, like you explained, at least I can say. I was wondering, like at some point you mentioned how the people who was actually interacting with all these recyclable items were having those senses, and sometimes they were like more knowledgeable about those items than maybe we do. Like even yesterday I learned what kind of paper can be recyclable or what cannot be recyclable. So like I was wondering, how can their experience help actually to create an alternative system, both in Delhi or also maybe how their knowledge can help us to create better recycling systems maybe in our countries as well, because like now we are trying to go for zero waste and we are trying to put some separate garbage bins all around, but it's still so challenging for us to know which plastic goes to recyclable bin, which doesn't, or something like that. So like what we can learn from them or from their experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so the first thing is that, of course, the best way to go for zero waste is to reduce our waste, right? And this is something we, of course, all know, but it's worth repeating just because everything else that we do down the line is certainly second best. And, one of the things is, of course, recycling, at least in this country, I know its history better in the United States. And when it was promoted as a municipal service here in the United States, it very quickly got the support of business because, and big corporations, because it was something that they recognized would benefit them in the long term, because it would allow them to continue producing all of those materials in the first place, right? And so it was started by the environmental movement here, but then very quickly businesses saw this as an opportunity and realized that reduction was going to be much more costly for them than promoting recycling would be. But yeah, I think one of the things that this teaches us, well, first of all, just acknowledging that this is happening under circumstances that aren't by their own choosing. And really is, forces them to confront their garbage. And I think there's a question to be asked about who has to confront garbage in any society, right? And who's dealing with the consequences of all of the waste that's being produced, especially by those of us who are able to, have access to those resources. But yeah, certainly like they, and I think in that direct sensory confrontation of the materials, it brings into focus what can be recycled, what can't be recycled. Gosh, there's just so many lessons to learn from that. On the one hand, I think there's a lot of power, my initial response would be there's a lot of power just in having to confront those things. And most of our waste systems are designed so that the majority of us don't have to confront those things, so that we don't question their production and we don't challenge the system as it is, in the system as it is being, of course, very, very wasteful. And we know that a lot of the things that we think or hope get recycled don't actually get recycled. I'm having my students I have a class called the Sociology of Garbage. And my students are working on papers where they talk about their waste over the day. And one of the things that I want them to be, to speak to is what happens to the stuff they're throwing away. And certainly one of the challenges here in the US, and I'm sure for you there too, is you don't know. Like, even if you called the recycling facility, they may not know which plastics are currently being recycled or not. They may be accepting certain plastics and shipping them off, but those may or may not be recycled. And so it's just very difficult to know what is actually reprocessed, what's worth being reprocessed. This great question about net CO2 that I'm gonna like get off of here and try to figure out. You know, all of these questions are of course, very difficult to answer and require a lot of expertise in order to be able to get real answers to. So yeah, so a long-winded question. I think there's a lot that we can learn from them. I think you know, maybe it's this challenge, this ethical challenge of being confronted with our things, and a reminder, as you rightfully said, that we don't always know what can be recycled. And I think, you know, it's not just you. I think even the people who are receiving our recyclables may not know. So certainly not anything that any individual one of us is doing wrong, but it's all of us living within the systems that are being promoted.
Thank you.
Yeah. Pinar.
Okay, me again, if there's no one else, so I'm just the second time, so maybe, I don't know. Okay, I just have two quick questions then. The first is, I was glad to see that you mentioned environmentalism of the poor and Joan Martinez-Aliar. That's something we teach here too at the Institute. I was wondering, I mean, Joan Martinez-Aliar and his team, they usually see these, I mean, environmentalism of the poor, if it is consolidated as a resistance movement, for instance, then it can also lead to sustainability transformation in certain cases. So whether that's the case there, any type of resistance movement, whether it's like people coming together and like, okay, we've seen protests against incinerators, but is it just neighborhoods, or is it also the workers themselves, like doing recycling? And the second question would be more methodological. You said that you're also using participant observation. So how do you do it in a country like India? And what are some of the challenges that you have faced when doing this? That would be the second one. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So yeah, so in fact, one of Martinez-Aliar's, I believe, students, I don't want to misspeak, but yeah, so there's been work discussing some of the movements that were confronting the incinerators, and there are a couple of great published pieces, and for some reason, okay, Federico De Maria has published on this issue, and again, like when I mentioned, you know, there have been some takes that take a more political economic perspective, and don't necessarily get into the domain of culture and caste quite as much. So they have taken that up, and there was some initial resistance from the informal workers, and there were a couple of organizations that were working with them to attempt to organize. By and large, they were pretty short-lived movements and pretty scattershot movements. There's a little bit more I could say about that, but I would say at this point, the majority of that resistance is coming from neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods, definitely taking a pretty NIMBY, you know, attitude towards these waste-to-energy plants, yeah, but they've, you know, they were directly affected. Like when they started running, when this plant started running, they immediately saw ash in their homes. Like they had visible effects from this waste-to-energy plant that was running in Oka, and this case has been running as a result of that. So yeah, but there are, if you're interested in this case, in this issue, I would look up Federico De Maria's work, who has written about some of that resistance, and I've written a little bit about it in my work as well, but pretty short-lived overall. And then in terms of doing the field work, well, that would be a whole very long conversation, but I mean, I guess the short version of it is I had learned Hindi before starting this project, and had spent a couple of years in India doing, you know, language learning and working in the development sector. And so I had a kind of, you know, a sense of bearing, which I always think is really important whenever somebody is going into a place, as you may have guessed, that I didn't have any kind of like familial relationship to before, you know, before choosing to have a connection with India. But yeah, certainly doing language learning. I had studied Indian history, so I had like a pretty, I had a strong basis, I think, for beginning to ask some of the right questions about what was going on. And then in terms of doing the fieldwork, I was fortunate to be connected with actually a labor organizer who was attempting to organize people in the city. It was a pretty small movement, unfortunately, but a really important one. And he was doing really incredible work, and it got me connected with communities in the first place, but was also important because, like I said, not all of those communities were super active within the movement. So it allowed me to connect with communities that weren't explicitly being organized by NGOs or even this labor organizer, to sort of see what was going on at an everyday level. So.
Thank you, Dana. I know we're passing our time limit for 1 minute, but we have one last question, which is asking you about the link of this landfill, the huge landfill that you just showed us. Does that interfere with groundwater quality? Are you aware of anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, there's not even a plastic liner under, under that landfill. So yes, absolutely. It's a disaster. Yeah, groundwater quality. I haven't seen numbers put to that, but I can tell you unequivocally that it would. Groundwater levels also sinking in Delhi. So yeah, I mean, groundwater is a really important problem in the city overall.
Thank you. So thank you for all of the participants, and mostly to you, Dana, who woke up very early to give us this talk. And for the last hour, we talked about another wicked problem where it's the problem is we're trying to understand the problem, but the solution is not clear. Seems like we all have to keep working on it, try to find a solution to all of these wicked problems that we as humans have generated over the last century. Okay, thank you very much for everyone. We would like to continue seeing this crowd for our following seminar series as well. Okay, thanks again, Dana. It was wonderful to see you and wonderful to listen to you.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, bye.